time to start. It's my great pleasure to greet Orsolya Valkó in this seminar room. Orsi has a kind of Debrecenian students and PhD students and postdoctoral fellow and staff here. So he gets his PhD in the next building, then work there for plants and then grasses, and later he moved to the Ecological Research Center near Budapest, where he is a group leader of an airborne application or proposal, and she's presenting.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm not very top of my head.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Zoli, for the invitation. It's very nice to be here in Debrecen again, and I would like to talk about one of our favorite topics, about ecosystem engineer vertebrates in grasslands. So, as Zoli said, I'm a botanist. I'm mostly working with grasses and grasslands, but I'm also interested in the effect of animals on these ecosystems. And I chose this topic because I think that most of you are zoologists, and probably this topic can be interesting for you. And I'm also very curious about the opinion of zoologists, because usually I present this topic to botanists. So, in the presentation, first I would like to give a short overview about the concept of ecosystem engineering, which you probably know. Just I would like to show some very interesting examples, and after that I would like to show two of our studies which are related to these very interesting plant-animal interactions, and finally I would like to present a short outlook and briefly talk about other ongoing studies related to the topic. So, most of you know that ecosystem engineers are very interesting organisms. There are both plant, animal, and microorganisms that could be considered as ecosystem engineers. So these animals or plants, these organisms exert control over resources which are very important to other organisms. So they can create, for example, microhabitats, or they can create large habitat patches, or they can transform the whole landscapes in a way that they affect the other plants and animals living there. So they are often considered also as keystone species, and they have a disproportionately larger effect on other organisms than most of the other species. Here you can see two very well-known and impressive examples of ecosystem engineers. So this is a really broad concept. You know, the corals are also ecosystem engineers. They create reefs and habitats for a lot of other organisms, or even the beaver transform the whole landscape and create habitats for a lot of other species. But we are studying ecosystem engineers in grasslands. So first I would like to start a bit further, and I would like to show some very impressive examples of grassland ecosystem engineers throughout the world. So you might have heard about this very interesting bird, the firehawk or fire kite. Recently, ethno-ecologists discovered this phenomenon, which is very interesting. There are some birds of prey in Australia who take advantage of wildfires. If there is a wildfire, they actively spread the wildfire by picking up the burning or sparkling wooden parts, and they spread the fire over other areas. So after that they can forage there for the prey. So it's very impressive how a bird can control the whole fire regimes over landscape. So this is one of a very impressive example of ecosystem engineering. Other very impressive examples could be, for example, equids in very arid environments, where these wild donkeys have been found to dig these holes in the arid environments, and they alter the water regime in the whole area and increase the water availability. And this is very important for other animals and also for plants as well. So these are very large-scale transformations of landscapes. And there is a certain group of animals which is very much considered as ecosystem engineers, the burrowing mammals, mostly from the orders Rodentia and Marsupialia. This is a very important review paper about the conservation importance of these animals. So who is interested in these animals should read this old but very nice review paper. And this figure shows that these burrowing mammals inhabit all continents, but they mostly found in the arid environments, in diverse arid or semi-arid grasslands and other grassy habitats. You can see that, for example, in North America, the prairie dogs are very well known. In South America, the degus and the vizcachas. In Africa, several ground squirrels. And in Eurasia, different squirrels and marmots and pikas. And in Australia, it's a very, very important landscape transforming group, these burrowing mammals. So a lot of marsupial mammals create very, very intensive landscape transformation by burrowing activities. So just some examples of these burrowing mammals, just to give a short introduction to other continents. So, for example, here is this charming animal, the naked moor rat. They live in East Africa, in Kenya, and you can see that these animals really transform a lot of properties of the whole ecosystem. So they dig very, very deep and very complicated tunnel systems. They completely modify the soil structure. They eat below ground organs of the plants. Here, these researchers estimated how large is the soil moving effect of these animals. You can see that they move tons of soil, they produce a lot of burrows, they have a lot of effects on the ecosystems, both above ground and below ground. From Asia and Africa, we should mention the group of gerbials who also live in colonies, and they also move a lot of soil. So the researchers estimated the landscape scale activity of these animals and found that they are also very intensive soil moving organisms. Another example from Central America, from the deserts, these kangaroo rats. Here you can see what is the burrow of these kangaroo rats look like, and these are smaller features than the previous examples, but they are very important because in this landscape, fire is a very important disturbance, and these kangaroo rat mounds are the most important safe sites for the seeds. When a large fire event occurs, the seeds can be safe from fire in these fire break areas. And from North America, the pocket gopher, which is also a very impressive engineer. Even the researchers estimated that only one animal can mine this amount of soil each year. So it's very, it's compared to a building activity really, and they contribute to a very large turnover of the upper soil layers in the inhabited ecosystems. So these are examples from all over the world, and this is a very interesting review paper where these scientists made a summary of the very complex mechanisms, how these ecosystem engineer burrowing mammals can affect the whole ecosystem via their life processes, their behaviors, what are the traces and what are the direct impacts. So it's a very complicated figure, but it just shows some idea that really it's a very interesting process. It's called bioperturbation, so by a biotic agent, by some kind of vertebrate species, the soil system is modified very, very severely, and it has a lot of effects on the whole ecosystem. So this is the topic of our interest, bioperturbation by different vertebrate species. There are some very interesting review papers about ecosystem engineering in general and by vertebrates in particular. There we can observe some general features of these animals and their effects. So in general, we can say that these soil-disturbing vertebrates move soil layers, as we already have seen, and They create positive or negative landforms due to their activities, and these created patches, these landforms, modify the landscape in several ways. They create different patches with different nutrient availability, different water regime, different soil characteristics, and these patches are different from the matrix, and these patches are characterized by different or elevated ecosystem functioning. Here you can see this very nice wombat. Here you can see its burrow system in the individual level, and here you can see it from the bird's eye view, when you can see that it can be really large effect also in the landscape scale. So this landscape is really driven by the wombat. And some other general features which these reviews have already established about ecosystem engineering. So they found that the effect of these engineered species are the most pronounced and most persistent when we have larger animals who create a larger disturbance, or if they live in larger colonies. Yes, this is quite obvious. It sounds, cool. They found that these animals have the largest effect in lower latitudes, and they have the largest effect on the ecosystem when they use some site permanently. So, for example, when they have a burrow system and they live permanently in the burrow system, they have a larger effect than in the sites which they only use temporarily. And this meta-analysis showed that in general, the ecosystem engineered species have an overall positive effect on the diversity of other organisms. So it's quite a large increase of diversity. Of course, it's not the same what kind of other species are supported, just we should know that this is an increased diversity. So now let's go to our two case studies. In the first case study, we studied arid environment in Kazakhstan. We studied mammalian rodent species, the steppe marmot, and we studied permanently used and very distinct landscape features which are created by the marmots. And this is our funny team who went to Kazakhstan to this expedition. And just in a nutshell, let's talk about a little bit of our model species, the steppe marmot, the Marmota bobok, which is the largest marmot species in the world. And this species lives in colonies in the steppes originally. So here you can see its distribution area. You can see that the largest populations live in Kazakhstan, and there are some smaller and scattered populations in Russia and Ukraine. Originally it was a typical steppe species. It was a very common species, but even in the very big steppe areas, there have been a lot of habitat transformation, and a lot of steppe ecosystems have been ploughed. So there is a very interesting ongoing habitat shift of the species, and now it is there are a lot of populations in agroecosystems as well where they have other effects. But we focused on their effects in the steppe, in their original habitat. And you can see that it's considered as a least concern species in the IUCN Red List, which means that we should not really care about it, but it's not really true, because formerly its population was, I think, 6 times bigger than nowadays. So even it's a common species, but from a lot of sites it has disappeared, and it has a lot of threats, and the population is not stable. So, as it has a very important role in the ecosystem, I think it's very important to know a lot about this species and to protect its populations. Here you can see that even earlier the artist noticed that this species is doing something very interesting in the landscape. So they pictured the marmot inhabited landscapes like this, these undulated surfaces with a lot of mounds. Of course, in reality, it's not so dense, but kind of similar. So it's really an impressive landscape where these mammals are abundant. Yes, and what we studied, so we studied the burrows of these marmots. These marmots build a large burrow system. So this burrow system goes down to 3 meters underground. In Kazakhstan, the burrow system is deeper because the winters are colder, and in Ukraine and Russia, the burrow system is not as deep as in Kazakhstan because it's only -20, so it's not that big problem as in the Kazakh steppes where the winter is even harsher. And they use the burrows for almost all of their daily activities. So usually the males are very explorative, so they can go as far as 50 meters from the burrows sometimes, but the females and the youngsters usually spend all their time in the surface of the burrow or down in the tunnels. So they don't really go anywhere else because in these flat landscapes, they are very tasty prey items for lots of birds of prey. So they really use the burrows for shelter against the predators, and they use the burrow system to avoid the very hot or very cold weather. And of course, this is also the place of their hibernation. So the main thing is that for these marmots, these burrows are everything almost. So they really concentrate almost all their activities here. So this is absolutely a permanent place where they use the resources and modify the landscape. Yes, and we studied two types of burrows in areas where there is regular flooding in the springtime. They build small mounds. So these are the mounded burrows. And in areas which are not affected by spring inundation, they have flat burrows. You can see that the vegetation of the two types is quite distinct and different. So we studied these two types of burrows in Kostanay Oblast, in the Novorzum National Park in Kazakhstan, in very nice Tipalessingiana steppes. So these feather-grass steppes are very, very nice and ancient ecosystems. And when we went there, we hired a minivan and started from Szeged, Debrecen, and then went to Kazakhstan in a very long way, and then studied marmots and other interesting features of the steppe ecosystems there. So as I mentioned, we studied flat and mounded burrows, and each burrow was paired with the same sized intact steppe area as a control site. So the intact control site was not affected by the activities of the marmot, and it was not really grazed, so there were occasional large grazing animals, but no livestock grazing in the studied sites. And in the burrows and the intact steppe area, we recorded all the vascular plant species, their abundance. We measured the soil moisture content with TDR, and after that we were interested in the differences of the different functional groups of plant species, whether their abundance and species richness is different on the burrow and in the intact steppe. And here you can see the first result. So the species composition of the burrows and the steppes differed very markedly. So you can see that very, very distinct species composition was characteristic to the burrows, and the two types of the burrows were also very, very distinct. So these are the mounded burrows, and these are the flat burrows. And you can see that the burrows were characterized by higher plant diversity, lower soil moisture, and lower vegetation cover. And in these figures, every case, the marmot burrows are the gray boxes, and the intact steppe are the white boxes, and these are the flat burrows and the mounded burrows. So in the site with the flat burrows, the soil moisture was, you can see that this is the soil moisture in the burrow, and this is in the steppe. So you can see that the burrows were the driest habitats in the whole landscape, especially the mounded burrows, so they had the lowest amount of soil moisture in the whole landscape. And if we consider the total vegetation cover, we can say that both types of burrows had lower vegetation cover compared to the steppe, and especially the flat burrows were characterized by sparse vegetation. And if we consider the diversity of plants, there were very interesting differences. So in general, the burrows were more diverse than the steppes in both types of burrows. We were also interested in the cover of ruderal species, these weed-like species which are a bit disturbance tolerant. And we found that in the burrows, the abundance of ruderal species was a bit higher than in the steppes, but you can see that it's around maximum 10%. So it's not a weed-dominated patch, just there are some ruderal species there. And here you can see the steppe specialist species. Of course, the intact steppe was an ancient pristine ecosystem, so it was dominated by specialist species of the ecosystem. But also in the burrows, these species were the characteristic functional group, but their abundance was lower compared to the steppe. And it was a very interesting phenomenon that in the flat burrows, there were a lot of salt-tolerant halophyte species. So their abundance was almost half of the total cover, and these patches were very distinct patches characterized by several typical salt-tolerant species. So to discuss this case study, we can see that based on our results, these marmots can be considered as ecosystem engineers because they create different patches, patches different from the matrix. So you can see that in the structure, in the species composition, these patches are different from the intact steppe. And we also found that there are a lot of characteristic species which are confined to the burrows. So these species, these plants, don't occur anywhere else in the landscape, but only on these small burrow patches. And this is very important because it means that these spots are considered as hotspots in the landscape, which can increase the landscape scale environmental heterogeneity and diversity as well. And we found that there are differences in the environmental conditions in the burrows and the steppes. So the burrows are drier habitats that are regularly trampled, manured, and grazed by the marmots. So these are different habitat characteristics compared to the intact steppe. And we also found that these habitat conditions, which are maintained by the marmots, so they create the burrow, they maintain it by their everyday activity, they provide habitat conditions which are favorable for certain ecological groups of plant species, so for example for ruderal species and salt-tolerant species. It is a bit synonym or analog to the gardening activity, so because the marmot activities are concentrated on the burrows, the grazing, the manuring and the trampling are very similar to the gardening activities of humans, and it is very interesting that these activities are concentrated on the burrow, and it's beneficial for the marmots because by the intensive trampling, manuring and grazing, they enable that the vegetation can resprout multiple times during the season. So they can maintain a fresh green vegetation for themselves in their homes. This is very important for them because they don't have to go farther from the burrow. They can forage every time on their home. And they are not threatened by predators. They can run to the safe place very easily. So it's very important for the marmots as well that during their activity, their vegetation is maintained. And it's very interesting that these Ukrainian scientists had feeding experiments with marmots. They offered a variety of different plant species to the marmots, around 200 species, and they found that the most preferred food items of the marmots are exactly those that we found on the marmot burrows growing. So it's very interesting that they, with their everyday activities, support the vegetation which they really like and they really eat. And it's also very interesting that I mentioned that these flat burrows are covered by a lot of salt-tolerant plants. And in another marmot species in North America, this Armitage, he's a marmot ecologist, he's a top marmot scientist. He found that the marmots often forage on halophyte plants to provide their microelements which are important for their life cycle. So this salt-tolerant halophyte vegetation can be also very nutritious and important for the marmots. So just an outlook. As I mentioned, these burrows are not in so they are not solitary burrows, but they are in a network. So they form colonies, and these are patches in the matrix of the steppe, but they can be in a functional connection with each other. So they can be considered as stepping stones for the meta-populations of the plant species which are characteristic to the burrows. And the distance between burrows are absolutely coverable by pollinators or seed dispersal agents. So they are a couple of 50 or 80 meters apart from each other. And these are a bit analog, like our other Balázs's other favorite study object, the kurgans, which are also small spots in the steppe landscape where they can create diverse habitats and microhabitats. And these burrow systems are inhabited by the marmot family for some decades or for some years, and after there is a very big pressure of parasites, the marmot family either dies or goes to establish another burrow system. So after the family is gone from the burrow system, there is a succession of the burrows. It would be very interesting to study this phenomenon as well. But I have read that the structure of the burrows can remain for decades or even for centuries. So these humps in the steppe can be quite persistent landmarks. And there are a lot of them actually. So a recent study estimated the number of burrows in Kazakhstan using remote sensing techniques, and they estimated that there are 6 million marmots and more than 1 million actively used burrows now. So you can imagine that this is a really an important process in the studied ecosystem in the steppe. So it's very interesting, and there are a lot of future questions which would be cool to study in connection with these marmots, but unfortunately they live very far from here. So let's move to our other case study, which is much closer to us now. So the other case study about ecosystem engineers is about the cranes, and this is the very good season to talk about this because we are very near to the major migration route of the cranes, and this year it was a very good year for the crane migration. So it's a bit strange why, how come the crane here? So I will explain it shortly. What is the relationship between cranes and ecosystem engineering, because it's not so evident. All of you know the Eurasian crane, which is a bird of community interest in the EU, and this is one of the very few birds where the global population is increasing, and it's in a very good condition. I think that there are almost 500 million individuals in the world, and it's considered now as a least concern species of the IUCN, but of course it's protected over almost all its distribution range, and it's a very, very important species to consider and protect and study from multiple aspects. And we are interested in the effect of these iconic bird species on the vegetation. So here you can see that this is the breeding area of the cranes and the migration routes, and you can see that Hungary is situated in a very important migration pathway of the crane, and it offered us a good opportunity to study its effect on the grasslands in the Hortobágy National Park. As I mentioned, the cranes have increasing population trends, which is a very good news because of different reasons. One reason is that it seems to be not negatively affected and probably positively affected by the climate change, because the milder winters can make its migration easier. In many places of its breeding area there have been extensive wetland restoration campaigns, so it's also good for the species. And this species can also benefit from intensive agriculture, so it's very rare that bird species can benefit from intensive agriculture, but cranes can, because during migration they really like to feed on crop residues of corn monocultures, so this kind of habitat is not very good for most of the wildlife, but for the cranes during migration it's a very good habitat and very important. And because of this, there are often conflicts and not very good feelings between cranes and agriculture. Even cranes mostly feed on crop residues. It's more complicated than that, and there is it's an important human-wildlife conflict in certain areas along the migration route. And it's very interesting to study whether there is any effect of the cranes on the grasslands, so in another ecosystem type, and whether there is also human-wildlife conflict or not in this other type of ecosystem. And that is why we were interested in studying the effect of cranes in the alkali grasslands in the Orsolya National Park, because they have a very interesting effect, which is very well visible in certain areas, which is called daruszántés in Hungarian and crane ploughing it can be translated as crane ploughing in English. So it's a very special foraging activity of the cranes in grasslands. So as I mentioned, they really like to forage on crop residues in the cornfields, but they also like to use the grasslands as additional feeding areas. So sometimes large flocks of cranes go to certain parts of the landscape and forage in grasslands as well. And here in the grasslands, they search for invertebrate species, soil-dwelling invertebrate species, and they use their beaks to disturb very, very intensely the soil and the vegetation, and they feed on soil-dwelling invertebrates. And during this activity, or after this activity, the surface really resembles like a ploughed surface, so that is why we call it crane ploughing. And this is a close look at the ploughed area, and here you can see how it can look at the landscape scale. So these ploughings can be very large, so they can really affect large areas. Of course, sometimes the ploughings are smaller than this room, but sometimes they are really large and really impressive. We had two main objectives in this study. We wanted to evaluate the ecosystem engineering effects of the foraging Eurasian cranes in the alkaline grasslands, and we would like to evaluate whether we can link the protection of the migratory bird to the protection of the whole ecosystem. So what is the effect of this phenomenon on the whole ecosystem? Of course, there are a lot of open questions after our study, just we intended to start this line of research. So we had two groups of questions: whether the species composition and the structure of the vegetation is different or not in the crane disturbed sites and in the intact grasslands, and whether the foraging cranes affect the ecosystem services provided by the grasslands, for example, the forage quality and the pollination service. So here you can see our study sites in the Orsolya National Park. There were some sites near Nagyiván, other sites near Angyalháza. In total we had 10 sites, and in each site we had a pair design. So we had a crane ploughed area, and in the vicinity where it was possible we designated a similar grassland stand which is not affected by the cranes. So in the same elevation, with the same community type, with the same soil type, just not affected by the cranes. And in each site we had a lot of permanent plots, and we had a very, very detailed analysis of the vegetation composition. And we sampled the same plots in 4 occasions in 2 consecutive years to study the within year and between year differences in the vegetation. Here you can see how it looks, how a crane ploughed surface looks from the close look. And as I mentioned, we visited the same plot in the 4 occasions, and you can see that even if we look at the pictures, we can see that something is happening after the cranes. So in the upper row, here you can see the vegetation of the crane ploughed patches. And you can see that a lot of changes occur between the spring and the summer in the same patch. So we see different dynamics. And in the intact grasslands and in the spring and summer, we see the same festuca tussocks in both pictures, and nothing really happens. So this picture is, I think, a good visualization that the cranes are really bringing some dynamics to the system. Just some pictures to illustrate the magnitude of the ploughings in some sites in Angyalháza. And also here you can see that Aerophila verna is a spring ephemeral annual species, which is a very typical character species of the crane ploughed sites, and it's a very early vegetation picture of the crane ploughing sites. Here you can see the species compositional differences between the disturbed sites and the undisturbed grasslands. So the disturbed sites are the yellow symbols, and the undisturbed grasslands are the green symbols. And you can see that there is quite a good separation. So there is a species composition which is more characteristic to the crane ploughed sites. Here you can see a lot of annual species: Aerophila verna, Veronica verna, Myosotis stricta, and you can see some bulbous species like Ornithogalum kochi. And in the intergrasslands, the typical species are grass species and a lot of perennial forbs and grasses. And of course, the dominant species of the system, Festuca pseudovina, is characteristic of the undisturbed grassland patches. So it's a very interesting separation of the species composition. And I forgot to highlight that during this crane ploughing, the cranes go to a spot for a few weeks in a year. So this whole patch is created within a few weeks, and after that the cranes go away. So this is a temporal type of engineered patch compared to the marmot, which is a permanent one. Here you can see differences in the total vegetation cover between the disturbed and undisturbed patches. You can see that in this aspect, of course, there is a within-year difference. So from spring to summer, in both type of patches, there is an increase in the vegetation cover. And in general, the engineered patch can be considered as a sparsely vegetated patch compared to the intact patch. Here you can see the differences between the perennial graminoid cover. As I said, Festuca pseudovina and other perennial graminoids are the dominant component of the undisturbed grassland, while compared to the disturbed patches, where the cover of this functional group is much lower. And here you can see another important functional group, the short-lived forbs. And the disturbed patches are characterized by larger cover of the short-lived forbs, while the undisturbed grasslands have much less of this functional group. And we were also interested in the diversity and naturalness of the vegetation. It was interesting that the crane disturbed patches had significantly higher vegetation diversity compared to the undisturbed grasslands. But of course, it's not enough to consider only the pure numbers regarding diversity. So it's important to know what kind of species, what kind of ecological naturalness scores are characteristic of the higher diversity. And we found that if we consider the naturalness scores, the undisturbed grasslands were significantly more natural compared to the disturbed patches. These naturalness scores were calculated from the Borges social behavior type system, where different plant species are assigned to different naturalness values, and based on this we could assign mean naturalness value to each plot, and based on this we found that bit more disturbance tolerant and pioneer-like vegetation is characteristic to the disturbed patches compared to the undisturbed grasslands, which makes a lot of sense, of course. We were also interested in the forage quality values of the vegetation in the crane engineered patches and the intergrasslands. Unfortunately, we did not take a biomass sample, so it was an indirect estimation. It's a good study for the future to compare it directly. But there is a working system where different plant species of the Hungarian flora are characterized to different forage quality values, and we can evaluate whether the plants with lower or higher forage quality values are more abundant in the different patches. So we did this, and we found that in the disturbed patches, the forage quality score of the vegetation was lower compared to the undisturbed grasslands. So we can say based on that there is some decrease of forage quality in the crane disturbed areas. But it's also interesting and important to consider that in the disturbed patches, the vegetation sprouts much earlier compared to the undisturbed grasslands. And these years, especially in the very, very dry springs, where there is very important to feed somehow the grazing animals, these crane disturbed patches with the earlier sprouting vegetation can be very important feeding sources. So a bit lower forage quality scores can be somehow outweighed by the advantage of the earlier sprouting spring. But of course, this topic, I think it would need further investigations. It's very interesting, this kind of effect of the crane on the ecosystem. And also another indirect evaluation which we made, we considered whether there are more or less nectar source for the pollinators in the crane disturbed and non-disturbed patches. And it was very striking and very significant difference that the cover of insect-pollinated plants was significantly higher in the disturbed patches, while the undisturbed grasslands, mainly constituted by grasses, which are not insect-pollinated, they provided much less nectar source for the pollinators. Of course, it's also an indirect comparison, so it would be an interesting topic to study, for example, the pollinator assemblages in the disturbed and undisturbed patches. I think that this is a very good start to consider something like this, and this is a very important difference in the pollination service. And to discuss this crane topic, we found that the cranes can also be considered as ecosystem engineer species because they create distinct vegetation patches in the grass-dominated matrix, similar to the marmots. And these patches have distinct species composition, not as distinct as in the marmot, but a very different species composition compared to the matrix. And there are a lot of character species which are related to the crane disturbed patches. It is quite interesting, so it was a bit more shocking for us compared to the case of the marmot, because there are very, very few studies which also prove the effect of avian ecosystem engineers in grasslands, and even less in the temperate regions. So, and even less in cases where there are only temporal foraging sites. So these cranes do this effect within a few weeks every year. They can create very distinct patches which can last longer than their presence in the site. So it's quite novel and interesting, and there are other crane species in the world which also use grasslands for forage. So it would be interesting sometime to compare the effect of our crane to other cranes and our crane in other areas. So there is a lot of future questions which can be answered probably in the future. And it's interesting that the crane definitely has some effect on the grassland ecosystem, but there are trade-offs between the positive and negative effects. So there is an increased diversity, but it creates a little bit more disturbed and pioneer vegetation, so less natural vegetation. There is an increase in flower resources, which is good for a lot of components of the ecosystem, but there is some decreased forage quality. But the earlier sprouter vegetation is also another aspect. So it's a very complex system and very interesting. Yeah. And there are a lot of future questions. So, for example, we observed that these cranes have very large site fidelity. So usually they return to the ploughed patches every year. As long as we started to monitor these patches every year, in the same patches we observe the presence of the cranes and their marks. So they tend to use the same habitats every year, but of course we don't know that the same individuals use the same sites or not. It's also an interesting question. And why they go to the same place? Because of other behavioral factors, or only because it's easier to plough where they have already ploughed in the previous year? And is it possible that this ploughing also has an effect on the food availability. It's also a very good question whether the ploughing and these soil structural changes have some effect on the invertebrate species. So it would be interesting to study this component as well. And of course, it's a recurring disturbance. So every year these sites are a little bit disturbed. So what are the prospects for vegetation recovery? Will these patches be always some kind of disturbed and pioneer-like patches, or the succession will go on later? And what are the effects of climatic changes, both on the vegetation recovery and both on the migration patterns of the cranes or the habitat use? So a lot of questions. And also we studied these small scale effects, but of course it would be interesting to scale up the study and look for the landscape scale effects. These were the two studies which I thought that I have time to talk about in detail, but we have also other ongoing and past studies about other ecosystem engineer species. For example, we had recently published a paper about the lesser blind moret, which is also a very nice engineered species, a strictly protected subterranean mammal species, where we studied different hypotheses related to the patch and matrix and the contrast between the patches created by these animals and the matrix of the surrounding grassland. It's also one of our study questions, and we are also interested in the processes related to the seed dispersal of these soil disturbing mammals, because even these are smaller animals compared to the large herbivores, but soil disturbing rodents and other species are very important components of the grass ecosystems worldwide, and they are smaller but very abundant and very numerous, so they can also be very important seed dispersal vectors. Laura and Balázs wrote a review paper about this. And we are also interested in the effect of the engineers on the vertical distribution of the soil seed bank. In intact alkali grassland soils, we found that seeds can go down to very deep layers of the soil. So usually the largest proportion of the buried seeds are found in the uppermost soil layers, in the top 5 centimeters. But we found in intact alkali soil that if we dig down to 80 centimeters, we found quarter of the seed density in the deeper soil layers. So we think that ecosystem engineers are very important in this aspect, because they might have an effect on bringing up the deep buried seeds, and these very deep buried seeds, which would never have a chance for germinating, could have some role in the vegetation dynamics if we have the ecosystem engineer vertebrates. So there are a lot of very interesting study questions and directions with these species, and also they might have some practical applications also in grassland restoration. In other systems, we developed this establishment gap concept, which is a generally usable way of grassland restoration. If we create open patches and decrease the dominance of the perennial species, we can create good opportunities for a lot of species. If we sow high diversity seed mixtures in these patches, we can establish small biodiversity hotspots. And here comes the question: the ecosystem engineers often do this part, so they create these establishment gaps. Is it possible to use these gaps for restoration, for introduction of certain target species? So this is also a very interesting future research direction which we want to start sooner or later. And just to sum up everything which we were talking about in the past couple of minutes about the ecosystem engineer species. So I think that these are very interesting and important components of the grassland ecosystems. Vertebrate engineer species can be considered as keystone species that provide suitable establishment conditions for several grassland-related plant species, which have a lot of effect on the other components of the ecosystem. They can increase the environmental heterogeneity, and they create patches which are different from the matrix in a lot of aspects. and they can provide habitats for species with different environmental requirements. So because of these, I think that it's very important to study these very interesting and fascinating animals and their effects on the whole ecosystem, and with the conservation of these keystone animals or other engineers, we can help to conserve the whole ecosystem as well. So thank you very much for the attention, and you can read about our researches here.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, I'm curious how you estimated the total vegetation cover percentage in every fieldwork site.
In the marmot plots, we had, the main idea is that we should have the same area of the plot in the engineered patch and in the matrix. So in the marmots, we considered the sampling unit, the whole row, the whole patch, yes, because this is a very patchy vegetation, so there is the entrance of the burrow, which is more trampled, and there are patches, so we wanted to have everything in a whole, and we had the same, so we actually had a measurement tape, and we put the same measurement tape in the same shape in the intact plot. And we estimated the percentage in the whole patch, and the same size of the intact plot. And in the crane disturbed patches, we had fixed plots 1 by 1 meter, because it was a larger disturbance and not such heterogeneous. So we had a lot of fixed size plots and estimated the cover there.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yeah, so
very nice talk, thanks so much. I have a two-part question, and it's related to the future questions that you propose after the crane plot. So, is it possible that those plots, the crane plowing plots, were different to begin with from the other more undisturbed grasslands? And if that's so, do you see or can you find similar plots like the crane plowing plots with similar plant communities and vegetation structure that were not plowed by cranes in the neighboring area? So what I'm trying to get at, because you guys compared after the fact, are they different, that the cranes are hewing on some kind of structure that maybe more invertebrates are there, or is the effect of the cranes that you see?
It's a very good question. I was often thinking about the same question. I think that it's not very easy to study this before it happens, but we always had searched for a site which apparently looks very, very similar. So in the same elevation, really the same vegetation community in these landscapes. Elevation is a very good predictor of vegetation type. So we can be very sure that these were similar, but of course we cannot be completely sure. So it would be very interesting to study, for example, based on a digital elevation model, the same elevated sites which are disturbed by crane and not disturbed, and see whether there is some other environmental variable which can affect why the cranes choose this part and not this part. So we wanted to have the paired plots in the closest possible vicinity, but of course not adjacent, and we wanted to have in the same elevation, with the same grazing regime, with the same distance from the settlements. But yeah, so I think it's very, very interesting, and it could tell a lot about why the cranes go somewhere. Yeah.
Considering the co-evolution of the steppe vegetation and the burrowing mammals, are there estimations how important are the activities of the burrowing mammals in comparison to the large grazing herbivores?
There are some, I think Becker or one of the Dutch vegetation ecologists has some classical experiments with grazing of smaller and larger animals, but it was not in the steppe ecosystem. So I think it's a very good comparative study, but not in this ecosystem. Yeah, I think it's a very good question because I think they act on different scales. So of course they both introduce some heterogeneity, but these small mammals create more concentrated patches, more higher environmental contrast. So I think that their role is mainly in this, and the large grazing animals create the whole open character of the whole landscape. But I think it's a very good topic of further studies. Yeah.
I had the same question that Zoltán had, but I would actually like to extend this to the marmots as well, because I was wondering whether the same thing as he asked about the cranes, but also in the marmots, that there might be, for example, some microstructural difference in the soil, and so the marmots may not choose their burrow sites randomly. So do you think that there might be any inherent differences in the sites to begin with?
We were also thinking about this. What we could do, that we tried to discuss this with that we had a Kazakh colleague who introduced us to the site, and she said that she does not know about any that she was also thinking about this, but she does not know any evident explanation. But of course, I think in these ecosystem engineer studies, it's always a very good question, and it would be very nice to find some universal way how we can test it. Before, of course, for example, there are some marmot reintroduction studies where they put marmots in new habitats. There it would be very nice to have a preliminary vegetation map and then see where the marmots go, and we could estimate based on what they choose the patches. So yeah, I think it would be a very good opportunity. Unfortunately, they are inhabiting mostly the areas which are not very easy to go nowadays, but it would be very, very nice to do some kind of studies.
Sure. Another question is related to the definition of the ecosystem engineering species. So all the examples you showed are species that do something very actively, right? The cranes or the animals that dig burrows. But what about species that might affect their environment much more passively? So for example, I was thinking about, if we're talking about avian ecosystem engineers, what about birds that might kill, for example, trees with their feces, or with communal roosting, with a lot of droppings, the manure, as you said, might also affect the vegetation. So do you also consider this as a sort of an ecosystem engineering, even if it's very passive, because they just...
Yeah, I would consider, yes, and I think it's very, very interesting. Perhaps it's a bit different because, yeah, so I think in these examples, even if it's not very evidently traceable, but there is some feedback between the activity of the animal, the response of the vegetation, and it has some effect also on the animal. In this case, which you mentioned, perhaps this feedback is not so evident, but I would consider it some kind of, at least some keystone species. And for example, I would consider also some shrub species or a large tree in a wooded pasture. It's also kind of ecosystem engineering. It's very passive, it only grows there, but it also creates microhabitat under the tree, the shade.
I think it can be a feedback. So for example, cormorants, you know, they nest on these bare trees, and the trees might be dead because, you know,
yes, and they need this. Okay. Yeah, it can be the feedback. So I think that in this case, it absolutely fits the concept.
Thank you.
Okay, so
I just would start back to the effect or the primary difference between the sites the cranes used and not used, or the sites used by the marmots and not used. That you might test these differences, because if you can make the disturbance by yourselves. So for instance, for the crane it's quite easy, because you just need some kind of equipment and just doing this, and then you can study the effect of this slight disturbance on the scale. For marmot it will be harder, because you have to drill some holes, but still you can work in this way.
I think it's a very good idea. Yes, for the planes, it could be, we could indirectly go back to the, I think it's a very good idea too.
Yeah, in this way you can test, so you can sort it out, this primary difference between the proposed primary difference between the sides.
Thank you. It's a very good idea.
One day.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so in the chat, Hanbo from Belgium asking, beavers are another example of rodent ecosystem engineers. I think it has been shown that experienced beavers build dams differently and can have a more significant eco-engineering effect. Parental training of young beavers would therefore be important for their role as ecosystem engineering. Do you think if there could be a similar phenomenon for marmots, for example, effects of size, age of active marmot colonies burrows on the degree of ecosystem engineering effect?
I think it's a very good comment, and thank you for the commenter. Yes, I can imagine that. I am sure that these are very important components of this effect. So that is why I'm happy to talk about this with zoologists and those people who work with the behavior and others, because I think that it's also a very important component which we could not integrate to our study so far, but it would be a very interesting things to study.
Thank you.
Other questions? No, thank you.
I have one more.
Okay, go ahead.
This is just it's not about your work, but you said that the global estimate for cranes is like 500,000, right? And then the Hortobite National Park says they have 200,000 cranes stopping over. So are we getting a majority or almost half of the global population, or is it an underestimate? Short?
It's much higher now.
Okay.
We took part in that crane conference is almost double that now. Just and many of the eastern cranes are also shifting to this area, so this was an explanation.
But even if it's a million, 200,000 is...
Yeah, it's
very
interesting.
This reference was from 2015, so it's perhaps it's not the newest one, but it's increasing and definitely
Slowly, the population is still exploding.
And do you have some ideas why Hortobite is so attractive for the
These
cranes?
populations are moving. The importance of these horizontal migration pathways are increasing, probably because of climatic process, disturbance in Asia. So I think many eastern Siberians are coming this way, including eastern shorebirds as well. So habitat deterioration are driving them to Europe. It's a guess.
Other questions?